It was supposed to be a quick trip to the basement, a mundane chore that I'd put off for weeks. The holiday lights had been sitting down there since last year, gathering dust among boxes of forgotten junk. I could have handled it alone, but Harper, my roommate, had insisted on tagging along. "You're such a wimp," she'd teased, her lips curving into that signature grin that was equal parts infuriating and irresistible. I'd rolled my eyes at her, but deep down, I didn't mind. It was impossible to mind when it came to Harper. She had this knack for turning the most ordinary moments into something lighter, brighter, and infinitely more bearable. Now, standing in the dimly lit basement, I wondered if maybe I should have come alone. The space smelled faintly of damp concrete and mildew, the air heavy and cool against my skin. My hands sifted through a box of decorations, but my attention kept drifting to her. Harper stood a few feet away, her phone flashlight cutting through the shadows as she scanned the shelves. Her golden brown hair caught the light, glowing faintly in the otherwise dim room. She was wearing one of her favorite hoodies, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, revealing the faintest trace of a tattoo on her forearm. A small, delicate thing she never talked about, but that I'd memorized all the same. "Anything yet?" she asked, her voice carrying easily in the quiet. "Not yet," I replied, my own voice sounding too loud in the stillness. I turned back to the boxes, forcing myself to focus, to not think about how close she was, or how her laughter earlier had echoed off the basement walls and sent a warm ripple through me. We'd lived together for over a year now, a dynamic born out of convenience, but one that had grown into something more, at least for me. In that time, I'd learned to tuck away the little sparks of attraction I felt for her, to bury them beneath layers of friendship and banter. It was safer that way. Easier. After all, Harper was everything I wasn't. Effortlessly confident, endlessly charming, and always surrounded by people who adored her. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room and command attention without even trying. And me? I was the quiet one, the overthinker, the girl who blended into the background more often than not. She'd never look at me the way I looked at her. I tried to remind myself of that as I rummaged through another box, the rough cardboard scraping against my fingers. But it was hard to ignore the little things. The way she leaned close to point out a stray ornament, her shoulder brushing mine. The way she hummed absently under her breath, a song I couldn't quite place but that made my heart ache all the same. "Got it!" Harper's triumphant voice broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see her crouched by a low shelf, pulling out a familiar box. She flashed me a grin, her eyes bright with the small victory. "See, not so scary after all." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You're insufferable. And yet, you can't live without me." She winked, standing and brushing dust from her knees. Her confidence was maddening, but it was also part of what made her so magnetic. As she stepped closer, I caught the faint scent of her perfume. Something floral and warm, familiar and comforting. My chest tightened, a sensation I'd grown used to but never learned to control. "Why are you just standing there?" she asked, her tone teasing but her eyes playful. "Are you planning to make me carry this all by myself?" "I figured you could use the workout," I shot back, smirking. "Ha ha," she deadpanned, sticking her tongue out at me before hoisting the box into her arms. "Come on, let's." Before she could finish, a loud clang echoed through the basement, startling us both. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat as the sound reverberated off the walls. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Harper shrugged, unbothered, and pointed her flashlight toward the far side of the room. "Probably just something shifting. It's not like this place is exactly stable." I wanted to believe her, but the unease curling in my chest told me otherwise. As if on cue, the basement door slammed shut behind us with a resounding thud. We both froze. Did it just lock?" I asked, the words barely audible. Harper set the box down and strode to the door, her expression shifting from amused to focused. She rattled the handle once, then again, harder this time. "It's stuck," she confirmed, her voice calm but edged with annoyance. "Guess we're trapped for a bit." Her words hit me like a punch. I stared at her, my pulse quickening as the realization sank in. "You're kidding, right?" "Nope." She leaned against the wall, crossing her arms with an infuriatingly casual air. "Looks like it's just you and me, roommate." I couldn't tell if she was trying to lighten the mood or if she genuinely wasn't fazed by the situation. But either way, it didn't help. I started pacing, my nerves fraying with every step. "My phone's upstairs," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "Mine doesn't get service down here," she replied with a shrug. Of course it didn't. Harper watched me with a faint smile, her amusement evident. "Relax," she said, her voice softening. "We'll figure it out. Besides," she added, her grin widening, "it's not so bad being stuck with me, is it?" Her words were playful, but the way she looked at me, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite name, sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to smile back, tried to match her energy, but the truth was, I wasn't scared of being trapped in the basement. I was scared of what might happen now that we were alone. As I knelt to tug the box free from the bottom shelf, the sound hit me, a sharp, metallic clang that echoed like a warning. My hands froze mid-pull, my heart lurching as the noise reverberated off the basement's concrete walls. Harper spun around, her flashlight slicing through the dim light. "What was that?" she asked, her voice edged with a rare trace of uncertainty. "I don't know," I said, my words almost swallowed by the pounding of my heart. "Maybe." Before I could finish, the basement door slammed shut with a force that made me jump. The sharp, final sound of it reverberated through the room, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. I stood slowly, dust clinging to my jeans and palms. The air seemed heavier now, the quiet oppressive. My throat tightened as I turned to Harper, her brows furrowed as she approached the door. Did it just lock?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound calm. She didn't answer right away, her focus on the door as she tested the handle. At first, she twisted it lightly, as if coaxing it to open, but when it didn't budge, she tried again, harder this time. The metal groaned under her grip, but didn't give. "It's stuck," she finally said, her frown deepening. She rattled the handle one more time for good measure before stepping back, hands on her hips. "Guess we're trapped for a bit." Her words settled over me like a lead weight. I stared at the closed door, my chest tightening with each passing second. "What do you mean, trapped?" I asked, the edges of my voice fraying with panic. Harper turned to me, one brow arching as if to say, "Seriously?" "Relax," she said, her tone infuriatingly calm. "It's just a door. Someone will hear us eventually, or worst case, we wait it out until someone comes looking." "Worst case?" I repeated, my voice pitching higher. "My phone's upstairs." "So is mine," she replied with a shrug. "And even if I had it, there's no signal down here anyway. You know that." Her nonchalance was maddening, but it was also exactly like her. Harper was the kind of person who could face any problem with a grin and a quip, as though nothing could truly touch her. It was one of the things I envied about her. One of the things that drew me to her. I turned away, pacing the small space as my thoughts raced. The basement wasn't particularly large, but it felt like the walls were closing in, the damp air pressing against my chest. My mind conjured every worst-case scenario it could muster, from being stuck down here for hours to, no, I couldn't think about that. "Hey," Harper said, her voice softer now. "Breathe, okay? It's not the end of the world." I looked over my shoulder at her, and there she was, leaning casually against the wall like this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Her flashlight rested on a nearby shelf, casting a warm glow that softened the angles of her face. She met my gaze, her expression light but watchful, as if she could see every frantic thought rushing through my head. "We'll figure it out," she added, her voice steady calm. "Besides," she continued, a teasing smile creeping onto her lips, "it's not so bad being stuck with me, is it?" The words were playful, harmless on the surface, but something in the way she said them made my breath catch. Her tone was too soft, her smile lingering just a second too long. I swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of the way the dim light played across her features, the way her eyes glinted with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't the first time she'd teased me, but this felt different. Intimate, almost. My voice faltered, the response catching in my throat. She chuckled, low and warm, and the sound sent a shiver down my spine. "You're cute when you're flustered, you know that?" My cheeks burned, and I turned away quickly, pretending to inspect the shelves as if there were some magical escape route I'd missed. Anything to avoid the intensity of her gaze. The truth was, being stuck with Harper wasn't the problem. The problem was how easily she unraveled me. How every casual touch, every teasing smile, every glance that lingered a second too long seemed to chip away at the walls I'd built around my feelings for her. She didn't know what she was doing to me. How could she? To her, this was just another moment of playful banter, something we'd laugh about later. But for me, it was a dangerous game. "Okay, seriously," she said after a beat, her voice pulling me back to the present. "It's not like we're going to be down here forever. Just sit tight, and we'll figure something out." She motioned to an old blanket folded in the corner, its edges frayed but still intact. "Why don't we sit? No point pacing yourself into a meltdown." I hesitated, my pulse racing. Sitting meant being closer to her, and I wasn't sure I could handle that. But the logical part of me knew she was right. Pacing wasn't helping. Reluctantly, I crossed the room and sat down, the blanket scratchy beneath me. Harper followed suit, her shoulder brushing mine as she settled in beside me. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it set every nerve in my body alight. I bit the inside of my cheek, willing myself to stay calm, to not let her see how much she affected me. "See, not so bad," she said, nudging me gently. Her tone was light, but her eyes stayed on me, watching, waiting. The air between us felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to break the silence or let it stretch just a little longer. The minutes dragged, each one stretching endlessly as the cold seeped into the basement. The chill in the air was biting now, wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. Harper had found an old blanket folded in the corner earlier, and we were now huddled together on it. The coarse fabric scratched against my hands, but I barely noticed. All I could feel was the warmth radiating from her, our shoulders pressed together as we tried to stave off the cold. The proximity was both comforting and agonizing. Harper didn't seem to mind, she never did. She was calm, her body language loose and relaxed, like being trapped in a basement was just another minor inconvenience to laugh about later. Meanwhile, I was trying to control my breathing, to ignore the way my nerves frayed every time her arm brushed against mine. "You're quiet," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. It was soft, curious, like she wasn't asking a question so much as nudging me toward saying something, anything. I shrugged, staring down at my hands. "Just thinking." She tilted her head, her golden brown hair falling over her shoulder as she turned to look at me. "About what?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer without revealing too much. "How we're going to get out of here," I said finally, avoiding her gaze. Harper snorted, a sound that somehow managed to be both dismissive and endearing. "You're always thinking about the practical stuff. Relax a little. It's not like the world's ending." Easy for her to say. My world felt like it was on the verge of imploding, and it had nothing to do with being trapped. I didn't respond, and for a while, the only sound was the faint hum of the building above us, muffled and distant. "Do you ever think about how weird this is?" she asked suddenly. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Weird? What do you mean?" She gestured vaguely between us, her smile soft but thoughtful. "Living together. Spending all this time together. And yet, I feel like there's so much I don't know about you." Her words struck a chord I wasn't ready to confront. My heart skipped, and I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes fixed on a crack in the concrete floor. "Like what?" "Like why you always seem to hold back," she said, her voice quieter now, more serious. "Like there's something you're afraid to say." I froze, her words slicing through me with a precision I hadn't expected. She didn't say it with accusation, it was more of an observation, but it hit just the same. I felt exposed, like she'd peeled back a layer I didn't even realize I was hiding behind. "I don't know what you mean," I said quickly, the lie tumbling out before I could stop it. My voice was too rushed, too defensive, and I knew immediately that it hadn't convinced her. She let out a soft laugh, the sound laced with affection. "You're a terrible liar," she said, shaking her head. Her gaze lingered on me, warm and intent, as if she could see every thought I was trying to bury. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I kept my eyes locked on the floor, afraid that if I looked at her, she'd see everything I was trying so hard to keep hidden. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know," she said after a long moment. Her voice was softer now, almost hesitant, but there was a certainty in her tone that made my chest tighten. The air between us shifted, heavy with unspoken truths. My mind screamed at me to change the subject, to laugh it off or make some sarcastic comment that would break the tension. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Every part of me was locked in place, waiting, as if on the edge of a precipice. And then her hand brushed against mine. It was tentative, deliberate, the faintest touch that sent a jolt through my entire body. I looked up, startled, and found her watching me with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Her hand didn't move. If anything, the touch lingered, light but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat, and the room seemed to shrink around us. She leaned in slightly, her face just inches from mine, her eyes searching for something. Permission, maybe, or reassurance. "Harper," I whispered, my voice trembling. I didn't even know what I was going to say, but her name fell from my lips like a plea. She didn't respond, at least not with words. Instead, she leaned in closer, her breath warm against my cheek. The world seemed to fall away, the cold, the damp, the lingering fear of being trapped. All of it faded, leaving only her. Her touch, her presence, the weight of her gaze. I didn't pull back, even though every rational part of my brain screamed at me to. Instead, I stayed rooted in place, my heart racing as she closed the distance between us. And then, just as I felt her breath against my lips, she stopped, her eyes flicking back to mine. "Is this okay?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak, the movement almost imperceptible. That was all the confirmation she needed. Before I could say another word, Harper closed the last sliver of space between us. Her lips met mine, soft and searching, as though she were testing the waters, waiting for any sign that she should stop. But stopping was the furthest thing from my mind. My entire body froze for a split second, the sheer shock of it overwhelming me. Then, as if a dam had burst, I melted into her. Every feeling I'd suppressed for so long, every look, every touch, every unspoken moment, flooded to the surface in an instant. Her hand cupped my cheek, grounding me as I kissed her back. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was something deeper, something that felt like a question and an answer all at once. My hands found her shoulders, tentative at first, but as the kiss deepened, I let go of the hesitation that had always held me back. When we finally pulled apart, my chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. Harper's forehead rested against mine, her breath warm and uneven against my skin. I couldn't open my eyes yet. I was afraid that if I did, the moment might disappear, that I'd wake up to find it had all been a dream. "I've wanted to do that for so long," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. My eyes fluttered open at her words, and there she was, her face inches from mine, her eyes filled with something I'd never seen before. Vulnerability. Hope. "You have." My voice cracked slightly, a mix of disbelief and the overwhelming rush of emotions surging through me. She nodded, a small, almost bashful smile tugging at her lips. It was a side of her I hadn't seen before, and it made my heart ache in the best way. "You're not as subtle as you think," she said, her tone light, teasing. But there was something deeper beneath her words, an unspoken acknowledgement of all the moments we'd danced around this. A nervous laugh bubbled up from my chest, and I covered my face with my hands, overwhelmed. "Oh my God! I thought I was being so careful." Harper chuckled, her fingers gently pulling my hands away so I couldn't hide. "Careful?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You don't think I notice the way you avoid looking at me when I get too close? Or how you always have an excuse to leave the room when things get intense?" Her words sent a blush creeping up my neck, and I couldn't help but groan. "Okay, fine, maybe I wasn't that subtle." "Not even a little," she said with a grin, but her voice softened as she continued. "But I didn't mind. I was just waiting for the right moment to say something." "And you thought this was the right moment?" I asked, gesturing to the cold, damp basement around us. She laughed again, the sound filling the room and warming me more than the blanket draped across our legs. "Well, you can't exactly run away from me down here, can you?" We both dissolved into laughter then, the tension that had hung over us for so long finally breaking. It felt like hours passed as we sat there, talking and unraveling all the walls we'd built between us. Harper told me about the moments she'd noticed me pulling away, how she'd worried I didn't feel the same, how she'd spent months debating whether or not to take a chance. And I told her everything. How I'd spent countless nights convincing myself she was out of my league, how I'd buried every look and feeling and touch because I thought there was no way she could ever feel the same. It was like unlocking a part of myself I didn't know had been trapped. At some point, the air didn't feel so cold anymore. The damp chill of the basement faded into the background, replaced by the warmth of her hand brushing against mine, her laughter ringing softly in my ears. Eventually, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, a faint voice called out from upstairs. "Hello, is someone down there?" We both turned toward the door, startled, and Harper groaned. "Finally," she muttered, though her tone was more amused than annoyed. The door creaked open, and one of our neighbors appeared, looking down at us with a mix of confusion and concern. "The door jammed," they explained sheepishly. "Sorry about that." Harper stood first, reaching down to help me up. My legs were stiff from sitting so long, but as soon as I was upright, I felt her hand find mine, her fingers lacing through mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't let go as we climbed the stairs, the dim basement giving way to the soft glow of the hallway light. My heart thudded in my chest as we stepped out into the warmth of the upstairs, unsure what would happen now that we were back in the real world. But Harper didn't waver. She held my hand like it was a promise, like this wasn't just some fleeting moment born out of circumstance. As we reached the doorway to our apartment, she stopped and turned to me, her smile soft but certain. "You okay?" she asked, her thumb brushing gently against the back of my hand. I nodded, unable to find the words. For the first time, I wasn't speechless because I was scared. I was speechless because I'd finally found what I didn't know I'd been searching for. And as Harper leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my temple, I knew that whatever happened next, we'd face it together.